It's a topic nobody has ever thought of doing this time of year. New Year's resolutions, fantasy baseball style. What are we doing this year? What are we stopping doing this year? What are we doing differently this year? I've got Michael Govier on the line to discuss just that on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody, to the first 2025 episode of the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Erik Halterman here, excited to be back on the mic. It should be me and James giving you a couple episodes a week for the next few weeks before the full crew gets going. And I've got a very special guest today, Michael Govier of the Palazzo Podcast. And Mike, I know we had to delay this by one day due to illness, so I assume your year is going absolutely terribly so far. You've been sick for at least a full quarter of the year.
Yeah, well, I feel so much better now that when you're down in the dumps and then you flip it over and you feel refreshed, man, you appreciate it that much more. So I'm excited. I'm happy to be here. I'm ready to talk baseball. It's 2025. We have never done a show together, so I'm happy to be on board with you too, Erik. Let's party.
Yeah, looking forward to it. We've got a fun one today. As mentioned in the intro, we've got fantasy baseball New Year's resolutions. I'm sure nobody is thinking about that at the start of January. So real cutting edge stuff here. But we've got a good mix of stuff that we think we're going to try to do differently this year. And, it's New Year's resolutions. Maybe we'll come back at the end of the show, Michael, and figure out how many of these we think we're actually going to follow through on. But are you optimistic? Do you think we're going to go 10 for 10?
Every year I think about what I could do better, what I did wrong, and really the last 2 years have really they've not gone poorly. It's really all context-based, and we'll discuss more of that as we get into it. But I'm open to ideas, and if there's any listeners out there, any viewers who want to jump in and have any ideas, I'd love to hear from you as well. So give me all the information I could possibly handle so that I can be paralyzed by it and make no decisions at all.
That sounds like an excellent way to start the year. That's what we do in January, give you all the info, and then, hey, you got February and March to sort it out, and then figure out that it's all wrong come April. We'll be getting to those resolutions in a few minutes, and as Mike said, feel free to drop yours in the chat and say hello as well. Hi, DVS71 Chicago from Berlin. Wow, that's very exciting.
That's a new one.
Transcontinental podcast now. Very exciting. But let's get to some of the recent headlines before we move on to our fantasy baseball resolutions. Let's talk about some of the biggest moves since Christmas, starting with one that I think you will care about, Mike. Gleyber Torres, a one-year deal with the Tigers. It's an interesting one. Gleyber Torres is decent. The last few years, he has some years where you're happy to have him on your team, some years where you're kind of disappointed, and there would be potentially some spots where he's a particularly exciting bounce back candidate. I'm not sure Detroit is one. Not a great place to hit. This one-year deal as well says to me that the team isn't seeing him as some stud they're going to rebuild the entire lineup around or anything like that. But what are your thoughts on Gleyber Torres himself before we move on to some of the other implications for the Tigers roster?
Well, the first things that come to mind when I'm thinking about what you were talking about in terms of what do the Tigers want? Did they believe in Gleyber? Do they feel that Torres is just a stopgap? They do one-year deals. This is what they're doing. The Jack Flaherty one is an ideal example of what they hope to accomplish, even though they traded him at the trade deadline and still made the playoffs, which is just a very rare situation for that to happen. But Flaherty was worth the deal, and they're hoping this is almost like an identical deal to Flaherty's, really. They're looking at 1 year, about the same price range, and power to left field is something that still can happen at Comerica. Yes, okay. It's a bigger field. It's a tougher field to hit in. But for gap power, it's great, right? And if you look at what he could do when it comes to doubles and hitting the ball to the gap, I feel like there's an opportunity for growth there in Gleyber's game. But if you combine the power to left field with that and looking to really maybe cash in next year which is something I don't see Gleyber being traded. The Tigers are going to try to make the playoffs, and he'll be a part of this roster all season long, barring some epic collapse. So I think this is a smart move, although one that I don't really see as a surprise from the Tigers, because Chris Ilitch is a tightwad, and he doesn't like to spend a lot of money. And they're still thinking about that Javi Baez deal that just looms over the memory of this franchise over the last 5 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. If they had gotten that one right, then there'd be, 2 or 3 more wins on the roster already. Or if they had not made that deal at all, maybe they'd be in the market for a more exciting option in the infield this winter. As far as the impacts on the rest of this Tigers roster, we're going to see Colt Keith moving to first base. Colt Keith is somebody who in NFBC drafts is going a little bit cheaper than Gleyber Torres. We're seeing Torres 206, 207 through all the drafts right now. Colt Keith, a couple rounds later, about 239. Going to be picking up first base eligibility, presumably adds a little bit of interest there, but also takes away pretty much all of the interest in Spencer Torkelson. Are there DH at-bats available, or is this somebody you're taking off your draft board until we hear about a trade?
Well, the funniest one I saw in the last week is Spencer Torkelson have a future as a pitcher? That is a real headline from a real website. Wow. I'm not going to say which one, but it was real. And I'm like, oh, well, that's, Anthony Gose. They did that with Anthony Gose. He was average, I would say, as a reliever, but he also wasn't, well, maybe he was Spencer Torkelson-esque in terms of the hype, but probably not, because Tork was a number 1 overall pick. But
yeah, it's not the move you want to be making this soon in your number 1 overall pick's career.
No, 2020, first overall pick. This is a time for Torkelson to come from the ashes. This is a classic baseball tale where a guy's left for dead, but he does have talent. I mean, he destroyed pitching in the second half of 2023 when he had his best season so far. Still didn't hit for much contact. It was really just all power. It was just dong after dong. And last year, he got a slight chance to show if he still had something later in the year. Even the playoff roster, he had like a moment in that playoff run, but it wasn't a lot. I just think that this he has enough in his bat that there's still more to be taken out of it. And I think if the growth in the player development has gotten so much better under Scott Harris, who runs the Tigers now, which I do believe it has, I don't think it's over. And injuries are going to come up too here. And I just know that Tork's going to be involved in this offense. I don't think he's going to be traded or anything yet. I think he's going to find a way into this lineup, and what kind of player he'll be in 2025, I'm still incomplete on that.
All right, so not fully out on Spencer Torkelson. Obviously, there's not going to be a ton of leagues where it makes sense to make him at all a priority, but I can understand trying to find the spot, maybe in a deep draft Champions League if nobody else is excited about him, which they won't be after these moves. Maybe worth one more shot. Just make sure you've got other first basemen in case he ends up, in the minors or on the bench all year. Other major deals since Christmas. We've got Corbin Burnes signing a 6-year deal with Arizona. One of the biggest free agents of the year, getting a $210 million contract. Corbin Burnes, as far as a landing spot, Arizona's nowhere near as much of a hitter's park as it used to be. But although it still is a little bit more of a hitter's park than normal. I guess Arizona is a decent team, so slightly above average chances at wins, but a pretty neutral landing spot for Burnes. But what do you view? What is your view on Burnes these days after he's kind of gone backwards, particularly in strikeout rate, significantly for several years? But of course, he's still a $210 million pitcher. Is he somebody you're happy having as your fantasy ace still?
I believe it was 2023. I remember I was very much kind of getting away from Burnes, and he ended up having not as good a season, although the bar he had set was so elite for a couple seasons in Milwaukee. And we saw a little bit more of, I guess, not growth, but a little bit of a return to what he can be, because it was a contract year, Baltimore, a new ballpark, a lot of changes for Burnes. And it was exciting to see him in Baltimore, and it's really a bummer how their season turned out. And Burnes is not really responsible for that too much, but it's all about the walks, He had a 3 walks per 9 in 2023. But outside of that, the last 4 years, he's kept it much much below that at like 2.3 or below per 9. So if he can maintain his control and walks, and I'm not so much as worried about the power or the home ballpark being a threat. You do worry about the division, though. I mean, I know that we play more of a balanced schedule, but, Coors and, of course, the Dodgers and the Padres, these are good teams with good offenses. So that's interesting. But I would say it's kind of a wash right now in terms of the change of location. Maybe a slight downgrade from where he was in Baltimore.
Yeah, I think that seems fair to me. Now, as far as where he's going in drafts right now, actually, this is a fun one. Through 238 drafts at NFBC, the exact same ADP for Corbin Burnes and Garrett Crochet. They're both at 36.13. So you've got Corbin Burnes, whose strikeout rate is collapsing, used to have a Garrett Crochet-esque strikeout rate, but now Burnes is more of an innings eater, you would say. 202 innings, 193 and 194 the last 3 seasons. Garrett Crochet, kind of the exact opposite. We've never even had a full season of a starter from him, or not a traditional starter. Of course, he didn't go more than 4 innings in the back half of last year, but truly elite numbers on a per inning basis. Who are you taking first, Corbin Burnes or Garrett Crochet?
This is just a classic. What's your league like? What's the context? I think with NFBC, you have to remember wins are important. So a team like Arizona, who should compete, even though they have a tough division, they went to the World Series, and even last year they turned it on in the second half, made a run. They were respectable. There's 15 wins easy, most likely for Corbin Burnes, so that helps. But all the other numbers, I feel like, will go to Crochet, barring walks, depending what happens with the walks and the whip. That's Crochet to me. I'd rather go Crochet, and I was really not a believer of Crochet last year. That's something that maybe I have a fantasy regret about.
Ooh. Yeah, I definitely was not on Crochet to the point that he ended up being. I did not have him as a top 5 starter or whatever he was for much of the season. I suppose I'd be on Crochet if I had to make that choice. I'm not particularly interested in having my fantasy ace be someone whose strikeout rate is in the range that Corbin Burnes is. But then, of course, we have the question here from Cat Life: what round is a good time to pick up a pitcher in Roto Leagues? I think that factors in here. If you're somebody who's going to pick up any pitcher around pick 36, with the rate at which pitchers are getting injured these days, maybe that pushes you towards the guy who's going to give you 190 innings, or at least who has given you that the last 3 years. It might just be a case of, if you're willing to jump that early, then you should be thinking more about Burnes. And if you don't like Crochet, you just shouldn't take a pitcher yet anyway. I
think Tarek Skubal is the ideal. Last year, I want to say, just off the top of my head, he was like a 40, 45 ADP, maybe a little higher than that as the season got closer and closer in the preseason last year. That's to me. Like, I get a couple elite hitters, and then I get myself a Skubal. I targeted Skubal a lot, and so I'd give myself credit for my homerism paying off on that. But that's the ideal to me there. If you're asking what the best answer is to that question, Cadla, I thought the Skubal last year is the ideal.
I think that makes some sense. Let's take a quick look at 2 other deals in the last couple days. Charlie Morton, a 1-year deal with the Orioles. I don't know if there's a lot to say there other than
still not retiring.
And still on your board, right? Still a reasonable option, not a priority, but he can still get outs. He can still get strikeouts.
It's amazing. I really thought he was done. He talked about retiring when he was in Tampa, and then he got through the Atlanta run, and now he's still going. So, as long as that curveball still has value, he has value in fantasy, right?
Yeah, I think I would not at all mind having Charlie Morton as one of my final starters before we get to the reserve rounds. I don't know exactly where he's going to settle, but something like that. Somebody who you think you're going to use in a sizable number of his starts, but not all of them. One final deal to talk about. We've got somebody coming over from Korea, Hye-Seong Kim, a former teammate with the Kiwoom Heroes of both Jung-Hoo Lee and Ha-Seong Kim. He signed a 3-year deal with the Dodgers. So if you were very excited for Hye-Seong Kim landing somewhere as a potential everyday player, I'm not sure that that's going to be a possibility in LA. As far as his profile, people may not be too familiar with him coming over from Korea. He makes a ton of contact, doesn't really get the ball over the fence at all. He did get 11 homers last year in the KBO, but that was his career high. He's typically in 5, 6, 7, that kind of range. Can really steal bases, though. He did steal 30 bases last year. And again, strikeout rate around 10, 11% last season. So you got to figure he's going to put the ball in play a lot, even against tougher pitchers. Not sure he's going to do much with it. Are you seeing this as someone who's going to fall into a fantasy relevant role? If the playing time's there, there should be enough steals that he could matter in roto leagues at least.
Well, look what happens with the Dodgers. I mean, injuries are a part of their story. They were still able to win the World Series, but not just because they had Shohei, but to me, the story is that they overcame so much roster chaos. And a guy like Miguel Rojas, who's 35, I think, this is a guy who's 10 years younger, right? So at the very least, he should be able to replicate what Rojas could do or what role he plays here. I know he doesn't have the veteran leadership, but they know that. They're signing a younger guy who I believe will play a role. And if you believe in Gavin Lux too, that's the other question. Is Gavin Lux somebody that, we're good? Lux is somebody we really trust now. I still think there's something to prove there, even though we did see some growth, I would say, from Lux at points last year. So he's going to fit in. Kim's going to be in the mix here, and it's a team that could score a lot of runs, and maybe they have better luck, and maybe the offense is even better in 2025, and Kim gets to be a part of that in some fashion. I could classically see a stretch here, Eric, where Kim is a fab pickup at a certain point of the season, and because an injury happens and he gets hot, and he steals a bunch of bases, scores a bunch of runs, hits for contact, and is very useful for a stretch.
Yeah, I could see him having stretches. I'm not sure I'm going to draft him in a standard league that's happening right now, but maybe in one of those deep 50-round draft and holds. He's the kind of guy where you draft him now and you figure you're going to have a month where he's quite good, and then you don't have to pick him up because you've already got him.
Look who's here. Look, if we're talking about Korean slap hitters, Uncle Ted. We were just talking about you pre-show. Would you show up? There he is. He's in the chat.
Ted,
what's up, buddy?
Surprisingly, has spoken out against drafting pitchers early. It's a new one.
This is what a new one. That's funny, but Uncle Ted knows his stuff. He's on the Palazzo show with us a lot, and I love Uncle Ted. He's always got opinions, but Korean slap hitter plays a role on this team and scores runs and is a productive guy for a certain point of the season. But it's just no way we can sit here and tell you that Kim will be a crucial difference maker right now on January 4th. We just can't.
Yeah, and I'm looking at his recent drafts over at NFBC, and at one time he went as soon as pick 192. That is far too rich for me. That is where you're drafting players who you think are going to start. Certainly he could, in the best case outcome, work his way into a starting role, play the whole season, steal enough bases. That 192 looks great, but not the range I'd be looking at him right now. If he's fallen late 300s or something where you're just taking chances, sure. That makes sense to me for Hye-Seong Kim. We are going to move on to the fantasy baseball resolutions portion of the show. I see we already got some fun ones in the chat. But first, I've got a message from RotoWire. The fantasy baseball season is just around the corner, and RotoWire has you covered for all your draft season or preseason draft prep. Customizable rankings to fit your league settings, cheat sheets for each position, extensive prospect rankings, and much more. And once your draft is complete, you can upload your league using RotoWire's My League feature to help with lineup decisions and free agent pickups throughout the season. See for yourself by heading over to rotowire.com/pod now to get free access. That's rotowire.com/pod. Still early season form for me. I'll nail those ad reads by the time we get to April, but not bad. rotowire.com/pod. It's a decent site. You might have heard of it. But now we're on to the main topic as promised. Fantasy baseball New Year's resolutions. We've got 5 or so each. We'll be going back and forth. I'll throw in some from the chat as well. But I want to start with your first one, Michael. What is the number one resolution you have given yourself for fantasy baseball in 2025?
Well, Eric, I said it last year. Uncle Ted's going crazy about Travis Bazzana in the chat. Wow. I said it last year, and I must say that I wasn't able to follow through on it. I'm not sure why, but it has to do with the type of leagues and the amount. Now, I play Dynasty, I play Redraft, and I play them both bountifully, I would say. And the dynasty is intensive. You're not going to be able to, unless you're just picking all the same guys, which is not something I do either. I got variation and different players on different teams in my dynasty. We're talking, I have a 30-team dynasty I'm in, full on with a full salary cap. So, I mean, I go deep in some leagues, and some leagues are just a 8-keeper, head-to-head 14-teamer, 5x5, standard issue, head-to-head cats. So I got a lot of variation. I need to cut that down. And that's one of my biggest goals. I said it last year, and I just I reduced like a touch, maybe 2 leagues. But then somebody else asked me, and I said yes because I just can't help myself. But I have to show discipline because I can't play in 7 dynasty leagues and then have 10 fab leagues where I'm working on mostly NFBC stuff every Sunday night. It's just too much. No, I mean, no player. I know there's some legends out there. I've heard them. I've met them. The John Posmas of the world, who they grind their fab in many, many different leagues with huge bankrolls. But if you want to get that huge bankroll, you got to start, I believe, more streamlined and narrower. And I've gotten a little bit away from that. I started that way in the biz when I came in 2020-ish, and I kind of got away from that because I got so many opportunities for people to ask me, hey, you want to play in this league? Hey, this is fun. Hey, I love your stuff. Let's play. You know, they butter me up, and then they take my money, and I'm just giving money away. So that's my number one goal this year, is to cut it all down and keep it more simplified with less amount of, head-to-head cats and rotos and points leagues and dynasties and all over the map on CBS, ESPN, Yahoo, all that stuff. Well, I don't play ESPN, but all those other formats I'm on.
So you're really just trying to pick a few that you can consider yourself a specialist in, try to figure out some things that particularly work for those formats. Because I know playing in a bunch of different formats, part of the fun is, what works over here, what works over there, what works over there. That definitely is fun. But also, if you get it wrong, then you're just playing the wrong game in a whole bunch of leagues. And like you said, giving money away.
Yes, I don't want to do that anymore. I know I've given a lot of people money, and I know they appreciate that. And I haven't been profitable in the last 2 years, I would say now, after some really good years in 21 and 22. I split with Eric Cross on a tag team league, which was a 15-team roto on NFBC, which was co-management. We crushed that league. It was the biggest payday I ever had. It was really cool. I was like, wow, I think I'm really onto something. I'm growing as a player. But I got too loose from the hip. And that's the lesson here, is I love head-to-head cats. I think I'm kind of I'd like to say I'm an above average head-to-head cats player for sure. I've played that for so long. I feel confident in that. But it's really, I think, the dynasty, because there's so much more of a player pool with all the minor leagues, which I love that stuff. That's one of the best parts about baseball, is it has such a deep world of players beyond what you get from like the NBA or the NFL. So I love that aspect, but I gotta tighten it up a bit.
Yeah, fair enough. I will go to one from the chat here. We've got Chad saying his number one fantasy baseball New Year's resolution is to not wait till Justin Lawrence to draft my first closer. Yeah, that's a good call there for sure. What do you think, particularly in these early drafts, if you miss the really locked-in closers, you really are waiting until Justin Lawrence? Do you fully agree with Chad here and say you got to just make sure you're not stuck with Justin Lawrence? You got to just take 2 early closers, pass up on some really good hitters. You got to just do it to make sure you're not stuck in this situation.
Were you in the First Pitch Arizona? We were both out there.
Yeah.
And were you in the Rick DiPietro NFBC panel that they talked about?
Yes.
The data was kind of showing that you really need to kind of maybe go for these elite closers. Maybe not the first one, but you can't wait much longer after that. It was really eye-opening for me. So I think that there is some truth to that now. I've always been the guy who waits on saves and loves to get, Daniel Bard a couple years back when he had a huge save, like 30 saves that year. He was free. I got him for like $15. I remember the first week of Fab that season, and he got 30 saves. But when you're stuck with the Justin Lawrences of the world and you're going back and forth between him and the 3 other Rockies relievers who are not getting the consistent saves, it becomes really exhausting, and it distracts you from other key areas where saves, if you could just lock it in, it's not as important of a category, I would argue, as some of the other ones if you're playing 5x5. So, yeah, I'm going to change my ways.
Yeah, I would say I 95% agree. The only thing I would add here is that as legitimate, true closers become a rarer and rarer species, if you're not in a league with an overall, so you don't actually need to rank great in every category, I wouldn't necessarily advocate for entering the draft trying to punt, but if everybody's paying up for closers and you just settle with two guys who might close, that's fine because, hey, they close and you're good, or they don't close and you say, you know what, it was a soft punt. I'm going to punt saves. I'm going to do well everywhere else. I'm already at an advantage because I was drafting hitters in round 3 while you were drafting Devin Williams. So if you're not in a league that demands you win saves as well, it's more attractive than ever to just punt. And so maybe, well, even there, I'm not taking Justin Lawrence, though, or I'm not taking this year's Rockies closer because I don't think I'm ever putting the Rockies closer into my lineup. I'm taking somebody who looks like they have a 50-50 shot to close for a team that's actually good. Somebody like a Jordan Romano or somebody like that, who I don't know. It might not work, but if it works, maybe I get an actual closer.
Well, I'm really glad you said that. I'm glad you said that. So you put the context on it. That's so important. We never want to become too centric on one area of the fantasy baseball world. Well said.
All right, moving on to my number 1 resolution. Most of mine are going to be pretty vague, but this one is pretty specific, and it is don't draft this year's Blake Snell in every league. And by this year's Blake Snell, I mean that star free agent who I'm pretty sure is really good, and I don't know why he's unsigned, and he's got to sign next week, right? Well, he's not signed this week, but he's got to sign next week, right? Well, he's still not signed, but next week, surely he's going to sign. He's really good. The whole world knows he's really good. I ended up with way too much Blake Snell last year, and hey, it helped me go on some second half tears.
Yeah.
He was actually back in the lineup, but if I had drafted someone who was there all season, I'm sure I wouldn't have had to go on that second half tear.
Hunter Brown?
Yeah, that might have worked a lot better. There's going to be probably 5-10 options in the next 10 to 15 starters who I could have gone with. This year, judging by the guys I've already drafted and their current free agent status, Jack Flaherty. He is going to remain unsigned in mid-March, and I'm going to be drafting him anyway, and I'm going to regret it because I said right now that I don't want to draft this year's Blake Snell. I hope it's no one. I hope that Jack Flaherty signs tomorrow for the sake of all the teams where I've already drafted him. I think he's very talented. I can understand why teams are skeptical of the fact that, he's only had one really good year in the last 4 or 5, and he kind of faded in the second half last year. But man, he was one of the best starters in the league for the first 3 months, and he was still actually pretty good after that trade to the Dodgers. So I can see why he would want to get paid a ton. So this is just one of those situations where it's ripe to go right down to the wire. And I don't want to be that fool again. I'm pretty sure I'm going to. But is this a problem you have, or are you good at avoiding guys in this situation?
When it comes to pitchers, I've made my mistakes. There's no doubt about it. There's players where Blake Snell's a guy that I was not interested in last year, so I didn't really have much of it. But, he really was on a tear in the second half. He was, like you said. So did that balance out the terrible first half? Hunter Brown was a guy who had a terrible first 5 weeks, just a month. It was awful. It was horrendous. But then he was so good the rest of the way. This happens. Starting pitchers got to work out the kinks at different parts of the season. I will say, on the Palazzo podcast, you got to toot your horn when you get the chance to do it because people don't know who you are until they know who you are. And I was really big on Jack Flaherty after never being a fan of him, ever. Never being a fan of him in his career. But I just believe in Chris Fetter, the pitching coach for the Tigers, so much. This guy is an excellent top 5, bar none. I'm not being a homer here. The guy just knows pitching. Look what he gets out of his staff. He took Skubal to the next level. Skubal was always talented, but he got the most out of Flaherty and Skubal, and there's points where Reese Olson last year was able to do that. So I just think that it's all about the context of the situation. If Flaherty, somebody says here, maybe Flaherty will come back to the Tigers, Chad's saying that'd be interesting. That would make me more curious because the context of where the player lands would matter here.
Right. Well, hey, if you're hyping up the Tigers pitching coach, go Alex Cobb. Maybe I don't know.
You're pushing me there. You're pushing me there, Eric. I'm glad you brought that up because I'm like, man, that is such a. I've been a Alex Cobb guy, waiting even in the later parts of his career. San Francisco, Tampa Bay, Cleveland. I've been all over the place. The LA Angels. I've been everywhere with Alex Cobb, and I never seem to get quite what I hope to get out of him. So if Chris Fetter's the guy I think he is, then you're right. Maybe I should be on the Cobb bandwagon, but he is getting older.
Worth a
Maeda didn't work out.
I would say. Yeah,
sure. Maeda was
it's not
that
like
didn't
they
work.
all work, but I don't think you're gonna have to pay much to take a late round shot on Alex Cobb. Let's move on to your second New Year's resolution, Mike, and I don't actually know what this one means, so tell me about it.
Yeah, I said chasing the dragon. I gotta stop chasing the dragon. I've tried to really learn when to bail on players, and there's no way. It's like day trading. No one can day trade masterfully. A lot of it's luck. Sometimes you catch a break, you do know something, and you act on that. But I'm sure the percentages on success of day trading is always going to be a lot lower than it is higher, no doubt about it. And that's what it is when you drop a player. I got to move on now. I feel like there's another asset that's taking control, that's showing me something that I need to be a part of, but I can't let this guy go. And sometimes I will jump on a guy a little too quickly, and I just got to continue to stop doing that. I got to be a little bit more patient. Spencer Swallenbach last year was a big regret. I picked him up all over the place. This is a guy I had across several dynasty leagues. I've had him sitting there for the last 3 years waiting. And then I bailed on him in redraft, and he exploded. I just did not see the K potential taking off as quickly as it did last year. And if I'd just been a little bit more patient. Same thing goes for Chad Green. We talk about closers, right? Inconsequential closers. But for a moment there, he did have an opportunity to get some saves last season. He was really cheap. I got him for like $7 one week, but then I dropped him literally the next week. And if I just been a little more patient, I could have got a couple more saves in a very competitive league, a main event, that is as competitive as it gets in terms of money. Man, the players know what they're doing. So that's what I'm kind of talking about here, is try to be a little bit more patient. I could have just said be more patient. But, I have a flair for the dramatic, Eric. What can I say?
Yeah. Well, chasing the dragon is much more exciting. I'm going to jump down the list on mine because I have one that actually maybe goes directly against that because, hey, you and I are different people. We might need to resolve ourselves to make different improvements. Yes. I have on my list be more willing to cut players. I think that I tend to do the opposite thing. I tend to say, well, I picked up this guy for a reason. I'm not just going to cut him again. I drafted him for a reason. I wanted him. The other area too, where I'm particularly slow, I think, to cut players is injured guys. There's the borderline cases where, the guy you took in, not the top 10 rounds, because you're almost definitely keeping him, but, around 11 to 13, and he gets hurt and it's early May, and it's not a short one. It's at least a month, but it's not guaranteed to be 2 or 3 months yet. And so I keep that guy far too often. I'm thinking in, NFBC style leagues with no injured list spots. I am just not willing to say, I think this was Max Muncy last year. And even there, I had the added factor of, well, you knew Max Muncy was going to get hurt. So if you were just going to cut him the first time he get hurt, what were you doing drafting him? You were expecting to have to sit him on your bench for, 3-4 weeks at some point. And Max Muncy, when he came back, he had a good 5 or 6 weeks at the end of the year. So it did, again, help with some late season charges. But I wouldn't have had to be in that position if I didn't hold him for, I think it turned out to be 3 full months that Max Muncy was out. I think I need to be a little bit more ruthless. I think particularly with injuries. I think maybe what you're saying, chasing the dragon, trying to get the next hot performer and trading in the hot performer you got last week. I think that definitely I agree with. I don't want to be doing that either. But in my case, it's the injured guys. You just got to say, you know what? It says a month. That's at least 6 weeks. You need those roster spots, and you need to be, taking chances on guys who come through. Max Muncy's just not going to help you for the next 2 months. Maybe it's going to be 3. Maybe it's going to be all year. Who knows? Don't clog your roster for that long, just waiting on a good September. So two opposite directions. Do you have that problem as well, or are you fully chasing the dragon all the time? Nobody ever sticks on your roster.
Oh, people stick, yeah. You hold too long, especially with the volume I play. I'm doing that. Yeah. But you guys hear it. Don't clog that up. Don't clog it, okay? It's important. So stay free of the clog. I think that's the big takeaway for me, and I'm always going to remember that. So thank you for that, Eric. Thank you so much.
Maybe we can get a plumbing sponsor next. Do we want to go to your? Yeah, do we want to go to your number 3 resolution? What do you got here?
Number 3. It's one of spoiler alert, yours.
Yeah,
we could join each other on number 3. More best ball leagues.
Yes.
Why did you say that?
Well, for me, I really love drafting. I don't think it's any secret that drafting is the best part of fantasy sports for most people. Drafting is incredible. You're creating this team out of nowhere. You get to feel so clever and creative. Nothing's gone wrong yet. You love most all of your teams when you're drafting. It's just a really fun exercise. It's what draws a lot of people to this hobby. Not lineup setting. People don't love that bit. There's some fun to it, certainly tracking how your players are doing recently, trying to get the best out of your roster. I'm not saying I dislike that. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't. And same for picking up players. It's not unfun, but it's not what draws you to the game. Certainly the drafting, I don't think I'm alone in this. Drafting is the most fun part of this. And so what happens is you do a whole lot of drafts in December, January, February, because, hey, it's draft season. This is so much fun. And then you can get into a situation where it becomes a bit of a chore in July and August. It doesn't have to be that way if you just sprinkle in a few best ball leagues where you get to do the drafting and you haven't added extra chores. You still are going to have plenty of lineup setting and waiver wire management, etc. If you're like me and you're doing just a ton of leagues, just make sure enough of them are best ball leagues. And I think that I need to just get into that format more, and then I can have all the fun drafting without, taking away fun by having too much to manage in July and August.
Well said, my good man. I will say I will modify this to add Gladiators, which is a newer format on NFBC, which I didn't play at all. I've never played one yet. I'm going to do that for sure. I wasn't like totally against it. I am not going to play a Gladiator. Screw you, people. I'd like to think I'm fairly open-minded. I just didn't get around to doing it. And I will also play a couple more draft and holds, which, again, I don't have to do fab. So best balls, you sold it well. I don't need to add to that. I agree with everything you said there. But, the draft and hold, I still have to set lineups, but we're in a finite roster world. So that's what it's all about. I just want to be in leagues where the roster is finite. There's no ads. We all have to live in the same world. It's like the same role-playing game. We all got to live in this massive online player world, right? That's all I want is more of those in 2025.
Yeah. So more best ball. Hopefully, I think that should be an easy one for us to follow through.
Yeah, now best ball Underdog is back in Michigan. Like I've been out of Underdog wasn't available for a few years, and they finally came back last year. So I'm very excited to get involved in that world for 2025 now. Woo!
Yeah, definitely going to work in a few of those. Been doing a few Gladiators, like you said. Really enjoying those as an addition to the fantasy world. I think was not a big points league guy. We might get into that more later, and that's one reason I didn't do a ton of best ball. But Gladiator being a roto 5x5 best ball is, that gets over that problem if you're somebody like me who really would prefer 5x5 if given the choice. So now that that's around, easy way to get more best ball in there. Let's get to another resolution from a listener. Make sure I find this one in here. We got one from Adam who says, my resolution is to enjoy each baseball game and fade more of the why isn't the front office doing this/that XYZ drama. One game at a time mindset. Yes. Good resolution as a fantasy baseball fan. Good resolution probably for a happier life in general, but it probably serves you in fantasy as well.
Good luck with all that, Adam.
Yeah. Resolution, be a better, more relaxed person who is, better in every way in the world.
I get that. I get that you want to zone out a bit too, and maybe not take things so seriously, especially there's so much in the world that we could focus on. And if you're a curious person, you'll never be able to know everything you can know during this lifetime. But holding owners in front offices to a standard is important, I believe, and that's going to be my job. I will continue to do that. I will hold Chris Illich and my team to a standard, not to be a hardcore. There's a certain point with Javi Baez where it just got a little bit too cruel, I would say at times. That's a good example of that. But I'm talking about the people who make choices. They have to be in front, and if they're not in front, it's fair to ask for accountability for them to come out and say why they do the things they do or don't do. That's all I ask.
Yeah, fair enough. But I think also as part of this resolution, we can wonder why they do those things. But also, we're probably not going to be able to affect them very much, unfortunately.
No. You're not going to get a Snyder cut of the team trade you want. It's never going to happen.
Unfortunately not. Go play out of the park baseball or Stratomatic or something. That's your answer there. Let's get back to our resolutions. I've got one of mine here, which is pay more attention to WHIP. So for me, I think that ERA is easy to say, well, ignore ERA. Don't look at ERA itself. When you want to find the guys who are going to have good ERAs, don't look at their past ERA. Look at the ERA estimators. Great. I can do that. I'm good at that. I'm good at ignoring the guys who had a 5 ERA, but all the ERA estimators said should have been in the high 3s. They're going to be fine next year. I'm good at knowing that. But then I sometimes think that I apply that thinking to WHIP, and I think, well, don't look at actual WHIP. Look at all the other underlying stuff. But WHIP is an underlying metric, right? It's not quite super fancy and advanced, but pitchers have a lot more direct control over their WHIP. Certainly the walks part of it. The hits, that has to do with BABIP and the quality of the opposing hitter. So certainly you can have guys who have an inflated WHIP one year, and usually you'll be able to find a high BABIP linked to that. But WHIP is a pretty real and pretty consistent stat in a way that ERA isn't. And I think that I can have a tendency to build high WHIP pitching staffs because I ignore ERA. I look at strikeouts because, hey, strikeout, that's obvious. You just look at strikeout rate. That's how strikeouts happen. So I target pitchers who strike out a lot of guys and who have a pretty good K minus BB, but because that strikeout rate's so high, they probably have an elevated walk rate. And then I build a full staff like that. And then all of my guys, I have the highest WHIP SP1 and the highest WHIP SP2 and the third highest WHIP SP3. I've got a good ERA and I've got a lot of strikeouts and I've got some chance that wins, but I just didn't include enough direct consideration of WHIP in that process. And I think that's just wrong. I think you can look directly at WHIP and say, I like that guy, his WHIP's good. I don't like that guy, his WHIP's bad.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. I think I could probably take a little bit of this myself, although I feel like I focus on it a fair amount. Maybe I need to check myself before I wreck myself. I don't know for sure, but I end up being a short in different ways on a lot of different staffs. So I really can't blame one thing like that. I think WHIP is important. I think we all know that, right? But you're right. Maybe it's more important than we need to understand that there is a certain amount of pitchers available who can get you a ton of Ks. And there's also a certain amount of pitchers that can keep your ratios real low. Like a George Kirby he's a freak in a way. He's a really unique guy in terms of his ability to shut down the walks totally in his control. It makes him a very special player, right?
Yeah.
And we know that about him.
Why he goes as a fantasy ace despite not striking guys out. But if you're like me, you're just like, well, it's just a WHIP. And then you ignore it. And that's just wrong. Other people are drafting these low WHIP pitchers and having success with them. I should probably learn how to do it. And for the listeners, maybe you are those other players. Maybe this WHIP is not your problem. But it's probably worth looking at your own teams and thinking, all right, is there a category that I just don't actually do a good enough job accounting for? Maybe for you could be, say, you don't actually get runs and RBI because you focus on the skills more than the playing time. You get these guys who do great when they're in there, but they're just not in there enough. Or maybe you're the opposite. Maybe you focus on, I got to get these, the playing time everywhere. I've got to get my leadoff hitters, my number 2 hitters, and then they're just not actually very good. So you do well in those counting stats and not the others. It's probably something for all of us, and this is a good time to take a step back and think about that.
No doubt.
Do you want to give us your 4th resolution, Mike?
Yeah, I gotta work on the emotional ties, the connections I had to certain players, like David Hamilton. I was really into him, but then I got real bitter because I didn't time his debut properly last year. Like I a lot of David Hamilton again, kind of like Schwellenbach in dynasty leagues, but in redraft I did the thing where I calculate, well, I got dynasty shares, so I'm going to chill on the redraft shares. And then I miss out on it. These silly compartmentalizations in my mind about players and the attachments I have to them, they have to be a lot more based in numbers to me. I got to reduce some of the emotional, and I've always talked about this. I'm really into the mental side of things as a fantasy baseball manager, not as a human being, of course, but as a fantasy baseball manager, we have all these relationships that are really unfounded and just irrational. We don't talk about them as much because they don't make for, to make it sound like we know what we're doing, possibly. But I have to be honest about some of these connections I have with players, and that would lead into some of the other resolutions we talked about when it comes to cutting players that I need to let go of, or getting over bias. Like Nolan Arenado, he fell apart finally last year, right? But I've always had a bias against Nolan Arenado. I wrote about this when I was at FTN and Fantrax. He's just a guy that I was like, I don't know what it was. I'm like, I don't think what I'm getting here is worth the draft spot. But more often than not, the numbers he put up, obviously in cores, were very, very useful in the draft spot he was going at. Why did I say no? I couldn't give you a really good answer other than like, I just don't buy it. But if you're not buying it, meanwhile, you're getting 3 years of production that is elite or above average, then what am I doing to myself? So I got to get over some of these weird hangups and disconnects I have with players.
So you're on that side of it, because I know there's some people who have the opposite, where they're he owes me kind of guy, where they've had bad experiences with the player and that makes them go for them anyway. I think both are probably wrong, and both are pretty common as well.
Yes.
Let's get out one more from a listener here. We've got our friend in Berlin saying, my resolution is to find one dynasty and one auction league to participate in. Great. I would highly recommend both of those formats if you haven't tried them out. Auctions, if you can get them with a room full of people who know what they're doing in an auction, is one of the best experiences you can have in fantasy. It's just a different way of, adds a whole extra dimension to building a roster.
I love it. I'm becoming more in love with it every year. I do the First Pitch Arizona one. I finally got into that 2 years ago, and now I'm in it again this year. I'm not going to relinquish my spot until they force me out. I just love being there live in Arizona for the first 23 rounds we do or whatever, and then we finish it up with a reserve draft through email. It's a lot of fun.
Nice. So highly recommend that, and a Dynasty League if you can find one of those as well. I'll jump back to one of my resolutions here, and that's to be more careful with fab. And so this is inspired by something that happened to me in Glarf, the league we are in together, where it was early August, and I think it was Kobe Mayo was coming up, and I had, 200 and something left, low 200s. Kobe Mayo was coming up. I also had some other needs. Maybe I needed to get another starting pitcher in there. Maybe I needed, to fill in for some injuries in the outfield or something. And so I set my bids in a way where if I won a certain amount of players, I was going to be left with just $1. And I just wasn't careful about this because I assumed I'm not going to win all these guys. I'm not even going to win Mayo. So it doesn't matter. I'm going to have $150 left. The big one's not going to be a problem. And then I won all of them, or I won just the exact wrong ones. I think I probably even had some combinations that would have gone over, so I couldn't have won those. So I thought I was safe. And I won the exact wrong combination that left me with a single dollar in fab for the final 2 months. Now, that league was a league where I had Blake Snell. So I actually went on a late season charge in that league all the way from like 7th to 2nd. And man, if I had just had, $10 in fab, would I have picked up 2 or 3 more points in the standings and won that league? Everybody has their what ifs. If they, Lucas Beery could have done something else and got a few more points, and maybe I wouldn't have, right? I don't want to say that this was the reason, but man, I shot myself in the foot in a preventable way. You just got to be more careful. Just can't assume, can't leave yourself with the chance of screwing yourself over like that. And I think there's a number of other ways that you can just back yourself in a corner with fab where you're thinking, well, it's not all going to work out. Well, what if it does? Make sure you're not in trouble.
Oh, man. Well, that is all too familiar, Eric. Ooh, man.
And any notable fab misadventures? Or do you have any fab-related resolutions or any ways you're trying to improve your fabbing this year?
Yeah, I think I just have to admit I'm going to make mistakes. That's all. Don't change too much, because I was thinking while you were talking, I go in one direction and then I go in extreme in another direction, and I still end up screwing myself. So there were mistakes I made. Carlos Rodriguez, the Brewers pitcher, got called up for like a start or two, and I spent way too much money on that. It was stupid. It was like $62. Nobody challenged my bid. It was terrible. It was a terrible idea, and that's money we really needed at the end of the season. $62 could have used when I had like $5 left in the last 3 weeks of the year. So fab, I know sometimes to strike big early, there was like 3-4 years ago, Tyler O'Neill was a big ad in a league I was in, had a really solid season. He was worth the money at the time. So I remember that. But then I also remember the patience of sticking it out. There's a lot of guys you can get at lower prices. That's one of the key fab things I'm applying for 2025. the guys who cost $5, $2, if you're talking about $1,000 budget, let's say, these really cheap guys that can be useful players for you in the short term. You don't have to spend on the biggest guy every week. That's really my big takeaway, is to remember that all these cheaper guys I got who were useful for me.
Yeah, that is a great call. If you look back at the winning team in your leagues and check out who they actually picked up in April and May, decent chance there was one or two rather cheap names who remained on the roster for most of the year. We got one more, I think, from each of us, but I've got a couple more from the chat I want to throw in here. We've got Dave Funnel saying, don't draft players with injury question marks. Roster players that will give you healthy answers. It's a good New Year's resolution. Hard to achieve. A few too many injury question marks out there, but certainly always wanting to do a better job making
Davey's
sure.
Specialty. He knows it well.
Yeah.
Listen to the man. That guy knows his stuff. What's up, Davey?
I thought you were going to say his specialty is drafting injured players.
The opposite. The opposite is true.
Nice. There's one more in here. We've got Uncle Ted saying, my biggest resolution is don't give up on hitters I draft early when it's still cold weather. That's a great point. Your hitters are going to look like they're slumping. A lot of them early in the season. Offense is just down. What looks like a big slump might only be a small slump. But man, when it's the entire season so far, when it's late April and you're like, I haven't seen anything good from this guy this year, it can be pretty tempting. It is important to remember that you should expect hitters to be a little bit cold early.
Yeah, the question is, though, what can you look for within that to maybe find some hope to say, okay, this could most likely just be a slow start in the colder weather. Like a Spencer Torkelson, he played in the cold weather, but he continued to stink horribly, right?
Right.
We've covered that in detail. So what about another guy who plays in Minnesota? Like a Jose Miranda's a guy that kind of bounced back a bit last year. Did he start slow? I'd have to look at the numbers again to go in the game log. But what are the things we could look for? Is it, hard hit rate? Is he hitting the ball hard, but just getting bad breaks? Is he not hitting the ball hard because it's colder, so the ball's not traveling as fast? It's interesting stuff that I'm going to look into this myself, actually. I'm kind of asking myself the question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, certainly, if you get through the end of April and either your strikeout rate, your contact metrics are still good, or your hard hit metrics are still good, if you're good still on at least one of those, then I'm willing to give you a chance. The toughest one, though, are when a guy is legitimately bad, but it hasn't been that long yet, and it's been cold, right? It's only been 1 month, and there's really not a lot there, but it's only been 1 month, and he plays up in the north, and, man, those are tough situations. There's not necessarily a one answer we can give for all of them, but certainly not giving up too early is an excellent resolution there. One more here from Chad. Stick to your process if you truly believe in it. I think that is a great one. Of course, if your process is bad, get a new process. But if you put in the time to get a good process and you believe in your process and then you go away from it right away, then why did you put in all that time in the first place? Chad says, can't imagine what it would have been like if people convinced me Bobby Miller would be good last year and I actually drafted him. If your process said stay away from Bobby Miller last year, well, trust that part of your process. That was a good one there.
There's a whole joke there. He had a bet with Nick Pollock about Bobby Miller in our early season of Palazzo, and that worked out well.
There you go. Great process. We should all follow that one. Don't draft the guys who will wind up being busts. That is a very good resolution. We got one more from each of us. I'm going to swap the order here to give you the last word because I like your final one here. My last one here is more straightforward. Give points leagues a chance. I alluded to this earlier. I think, like a lot of people in the industry, I prefer 5x5. I like the strategy of the Roto game, whether that's head-to-head or traditional Roto, I guess. I just prefer those categories. But a lot of people play points leagues. I get a lot of questions about points leagues. I want to be able to offer, informed advice about points leagues. I play in one or two a year. There is the issue that points leagues tend to vary in scoring systems, which makes it harder to give advice because if you tell me, is this guy good in my points league? Well, I'm not sure. What are all of the rules of your points league is a question you need to ask in a way that you don't for a Roto League. But yeah. I think I can still be a more helpful advice giver just by playing a couple more, even if they're different scoring systems from the exact questions I get. I think there's intuitions that I could get better on if I just played in a handful more of those. It's a popular format. It's not a bad format. It's just not quite my favorite. I should play it a few more anyway. I know this flies in the face of your first resolution, which was to reduce the variation. But again, hey, two different people. We might have different things we want to get better at this year. So that's one for me. Give points leagues more of a chance.
I love it. I love it. Points leagues are a lot of fun. That's also another area that I do play in, and I play head-to-head. I play just roto style as well. So so many things. So many fun ways to be a fantasy baseball player. It's so much fun.
Well, then don't resolve to have less fun then. I think we'll have more fun.
Wow, so easy. Enough. Wow. Yeah.
Well, do you want to take us away with our final resolution of the show? I like the one you've got here. Seems like it might be a little useful beyond fantasy baseball, unless you're meaning to apply it only in extremely narrow scope. Well, let's hear it.
Well, we can't all be Donald Trump when it comes to confidence, but I feel that my confidence still has work to do. And you're right, it is about my overall existence, not just as a fantasy baseball manager, but I wrote down in all caps, trust myself. Trust myself. I know what I'm doing. There's a certain point where you hit the tipping point of like knowledge. I know everything I need to know basically. There'll always be things to learn about new players as they come along, but the basics, if you've been playing this, I first played fantasy baseball in 1999. I've been doing this for a while. So I have to trust that I know what I'm doing. And this gets really hard for me. And I'm sure it is for just people who play fantasy baseball who are not public analysts either. But when you become a public analyst, you interact with a lot of people. Erik, I listen to him. He's a smart guy. He knows what he's talking about. So who am I to say that I know better than he does? And then there's 25 other podcasts and a bunch of websites out there and people on Twitter or Blue Sky or wherever the hell we are now. They're all out there with their opinions, and they've been playing for a while too. So the lesson for me is to stop deferring as much. I'd rather go down losing the way I want to lose, like knowing what I thought I knew and getting it wrong and then applying the lesson for next year. I love to take in what some other people are saying. I still want to do that, but it's a fine line between saying, I'm just going to trust what that person said. Like it happened a couple years ago at a main event, 2023. I'm there live in Las Vegas. You sit down and you draft in this huge room. This is in the Mirage Hotel. There's like 15 drafts going on at once. This is a massive conference area. And I somehow ended up drafting Manny Machado with my first pick. And I've never been a Manny Machado guy. But I was in it. This is the total truth. I was in a text thread the day before in my head-to-head home league draft. And this guy was talking up Manny Machado. He's like, dude, this is Manny's year. And it got in my head. And then I thought, well, what if it is Manny's year? And that you only get so much time. You get a minute and a half to make a pick. Even though I was somewhat prepared. I could have been more prepared, frankly. I ended up taking Manny Machado. And then he had it was not a good year. And I took Sandy Alcantara to buttress that in my back end of the first round. And he got hurt. And that all fell apart. So it's all about trusting me. I have to trust myself. I listen to others, but this is a life lesson for me too, because I do this in other areas. I defer a lot. I'm the philosopher's brain, I doubt a lot. I question things. And I got to do that a little bit less. That's really what I want to do for me, for my New Year's fantasy baseball resolutions.
Nice. I like it. Definitely don't stop listening to all that outside info, certainly. But the point is to come to an opinion yourself that you believe because you've, done some reasoning and some research and you've thought about the alternatives, but you've come to a conclusion that you like and you agree with and you accept it might be wrong because, we're drafting these teams in advance. And so it's not the case that, endless research is going to get you to the right perfect answer. The answer key is not out there. The point is to just put in some good work to a point you feel happy about it and then trust your process, like Chad was saying.
Yes.
So great set of resolutions there. Thank you, Mike. Thank you to all the listeners. Hopefully each of you have found at least one or two that you can take away and apply to your own game. Hey, maybe it's the exact opposite. Maybe you're too careful with Fab and you need to just let go and wing it a little more. Who knows? Maybe you really want to draft this year's Blake Snell for some reason. I wouldn't advise going the opposite of that one, but hey, there's a lot of variation here.
Something we don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Who knows? That's going to do it for the first show of the year here on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball Podcast. Really enjoyed being back on the mic, enjoyed being back with you listeners, and enjoyed getting the chance to chat with you, Mike. Anything going on in your world you want to let listeners know about before you head out?
Well, we're doing the Palazzo Podcast. That's our show. This is going to be our 6th year. It's unbelievable. We're making progress. We stuck it out. We got a great crew over there. Mike Virginia, Britton Allen, Benjamin Chase, Robbie Baseball, Sam Wershing. We got a whole crew of people over there. So come and check us out. The YouTube is home base more than ever. Now that Twitter is whatever the heck that is. I don't even know what it is. I don't even know where to go now on social media. But our home base, we're almost at 1,000 subs on YouTube. So come check us out. Palazzo Podcast, 2 L's, 2 Z's. We're ramping it up right now. In fact, I'm going to be doing our first Dynasty positional rankings here in a little bit on first base with my guy, Robbie Baseball, formerly the Dingers Pod, which was a great and now retired Dynasty Pod. So come join us. Palazzo Podcast. A lot of fun this year. We have a good time. We don't shove too much data down your throat. We try to have a few laughs, but we want to help you win. That's the goal.
Yeah, great stuff over there. Definitely go check that out. Thanks again, Michael. And I will be back on Monday with Ryan Boyer. We're going to be taking some off-season deep dives on some of the players who are the most confusing to figure out this winter. Remember, rotowire.com/pod to get free access over there. And I'll be back Monday. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Mike.